I found out the two people I trusted most in the world were betraying me in the worst possible way, not in a quiet moment at home, not through a late-night confession, but 11 minutes before I was supposed to walk down the aisle in a wedding dress that had taken 4 months to alter perfectly around my growing belly. I was 5 months pregnant. The venue was a renovated estate in Charleston, South Carolina. White magnolias everywhere. String lights along every beam. 200 guests already seated inside the main hall, and a string quartet playing something soft and inevitable. My wedding coordinator, Priya, had just left me alone for the first time all morning to go check on the flower arrangements at the altar. That was the only window of quiet I'd had since 6 a.m. I used it to breathe. I walked to the end of the bridal suite hallway to find a mirror, because I wanted to see myself one last time before everything changed. The hallway connected to the east wing of the estate, which was supposed to be empty. Staff only. No guests, no wedding party. But the second door on the left was not fully closed. I heard his laugh first. Low. Relaxed. The kind of laugh that belongs to a man who believes he is completely alone and completely safe. That was the laugh of Caleb Merritt, the man I had spent 3 years building a life with. The man whose child I was carrying. Then I heard her. My sister Lauren's voice, with that particular softness she only used when she wanted something. I didn't push the door open. I didn't breathe. I pressed myself flat against the wall beside the door frame, and I listened, because something colder than fear had moved through me, something that said, wait. Lauren said she was tired of waiting, that she had been patient for 2 years, that she had done everything he asked, and she was not going to keep playing the background role while I stood in the center of everything. 2 years. I had been with Caleb for 3. The math of that settled into my chest like a stone dropping into still water. Caleb told her to lower her voice. He said that in 40 minutes it would all be over, and she needed to hold it together just a little longer. He said once the paperwork was signed, everything would move fast. He used the word paperwork the way most people use the word finally, like it was a relief waiting at the end of a long road. I touched the small silver locket around my neck. It had belonged to my grandmother. Inside it was a photograph of her and my grandfather on their wedding day in 1962, and on the other side, something no one at the wedding knew about yet, a tiny embedded audio recorder. The size of a thumbnail. Battery-powered. Voice-activated. I had bought it 3 weeks earlier. Not because I suspected Caleb specifically, but because I had started noticing things. Small things. The kind of things that a woman in love tries very hard to explain away until she realizes she has been explaining them away for months. Caleb asking, more than once, what would happen to my father's business shares if something happened to me. Caleb becoming unusually interested in the trust fund my parents had set up when I was 19, which had ballooned significantly after my father sold his second company 2 years ago. Caleb using the word legacy in sentences where it didn't quite belong. And Lauren asking me, with what I had taken for sisterly concern, whether I had updated my estate documents now that I was pregnant, whether Caleb's name was on everything it should be, whether I had thought about what protections were in place for the baby. I had thought she was being responsible, loving even. I stood in that hallway and understood for the first time how precisely I had been managed. Caleb said, the trust transfer clause only activates once she signs the beneficiary amendment. Her attorney already drafted it as a routine pregnancy update. She thinks it's standard. She'll sign it on the honeymoon before she figures out what it actually does. Lauren said, and if she doesn't? Caleb took a breath. She will. She trusts me. That's the one thing about Evelyn. She always trusts the wrong people at exactly the right time. My name is Evelyn Hartwell, and I had trusted him, past tense, because something finished inside me in that corridor. Not dramatically, not with a crash. It ended the way a candle ends. The flame simply stopped, and the smoke drifted upward, and what remained was just wax. I pressed my hand against my stomach. The baby shifted, a small, slow movement, like a question. I thought, not today, not like this. Not inside a lie wearing white magnolias. I did not cry. I did not move until I had heard everything I needed to hear. And I needed to hear it all, because I knew what would happen if I walked into that room without enough. Caleb would soften his voice. Lauren would produce tears. Someone would say I was emotional from the pregnancy. Someone would say I had misunderstood. Someone would suggest we postpone and talk privately, and private, I now understood, was where their power lived. They had planned this in private. They had rehearsed it in private. They had made decisions about my child, my inheritance, and my future in rooms I wasn't in and conversations I wasn't part of. So I stayed in the hallway. I listened. The locket recorded. When I had what I needed, I walked back to the bridal suite, sat down in front of the vanity mirror, and opened my phone. I sent 3 messages, each one precise, each one necessary. And then I touched up my lipstick, straightened my veil, and picked up my bouquet. Because I was still going to walk down that aisle. Just not for the reason anyone in that room was expecting. The 3 messages I sent took less than 90 seconds to write. I had rehearsed them in my head for weeks, without knowing I was rehearsing them. That is the strange thing about preparation. Sometimes your instincts build the exit before your mind admits you might need one. The first message went to my father's attorney, Richard Cho. He had been handling Hartwell family legal matters for 22 years. He was already seated in the 3rd row, left side, because I had asked him to attend as a family representative when my father's health had declined too far for him to travel. I wrote, "Richard, I need you at the sound booth in the back left corner before the processional ends. Bring whatever you have on the beneficiary amendment Caleb's team submitted last week. Don't speak to anyone on his side first." The second message went to my best friend and maid of honor, Dominique Sellers. Dominique had done sound production for live events for 11 years. She knew every cable, every input, every output in any room she walked into. She had already scoped the estate's audio system that morning because she was meticulous about everything. I wrote, "Dom, I need you to connect my locket to the main speakers before the ceremony starts. The Bluetooth pairing code is 1109. Do not tell Priya. Do not let anyone touch the booth after you set it up." The third message went to my uncle, Marcus Hartwell, who sat on the board of the family holding company and who had never once in my life said anything that wasn't exactly what he meant. I wrote, "If Caleb approaches the officiant's microphone before I give you a signal, stand between them. You'll understand why in about 15 minutes. I put my phone face down on the vanity. In the mirror, I looked exactly like a bride. Composed, luminous, a little pale. The kind of pale that reads as emotion at a wedding. No one would question it. No one would look at my face and see what was actually happening behind it, which was not panic, not grief, not the collapse everyone would have predicted for a woman in my position. What was happening behind my face was architecture. I heard Priya's heels clicking back down the hallway toward the suite. I picked up my bouquet, white peonies and eucalyptus, with the locket resting against the stems where it looked like a decorative charm, and I stood. Priya opened the door and said I looked incredible and that it was almost time. I smiled. I told her I was ready. She adjusted my veil by a 1/4 inch and led me toward the entrance of the main hall, and I walked beside her like a woman who had not just heard the 2 people she loved most in the world discuss her unborn child as a financial inconvenience. The doors opened. 200 people turned to look at me. I saw Caleb first. He was standing at the altar with an expression I recognized, the one he wore in business meetings when he was confident the deal was already done. Easy. Settled. The expression of a man who believes the hard part is over. I saw Lauren in the 2nd row, in her dusty rose bridesmaid dress, with her hands folded and her eyes soft, watching me walk toward the altar with what looked, from a distance, like sisterly pride. I knew her face better than I knew my own some days. I had spent 31 years reading it. And what I saw underneath the softness, if you knew where to look, was the particular stillness of someone waiting for a transaction to clear. I saw Dominique at the back of the hall. She was standing near the sound booth, one hand resting on the panel. She caught my eye for exactly 1 second and gave me the smallest nod I have ever seen a human being produce. I saw Richard Cho slide quietly from his seat toward the back corner. I saw my Uncle Marcus adjust his posture in his chair, the subtle shift of a man who has received a message and decided to take it seriously. And I saw my mother in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, believing with her whole heart that she was watching the happiest moment of her daughter's life. That part hurt. My mother had no part in this. She was simply a woman who had raised 2 daughters and believed, the way good mothers do, that both of them were fundamentally who they appeared to be. She would find out today that one of them wasn't. I couldn't protect her from that. I could only make sure that what she found out was the truth, and that she heard it before it was too late to matter. I reached the altar. Caleb took my hand and leaned close to my ear and said I was beautiful.
His voice was warm.
His hand was steady. Whatever he was very good at this. At performing a version of love so convincing that even I, standing there knowing what I knew, felt the ghost of what I had once believed about him. I looked at him and said thank you. My voice didn't shake. The officiant began. He spoke about commitment and partnership and the courage it takes to choose another person. Every word landed with a particular irony that I absorbed quietly while 200 people smiled around me, and the string quartet finished its last piece, and the magnolias held their positions along every arch and column of the room. When the officiant reached the moment for vows, Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. He had written his own. He had told me weeks ago, with what I had taken for romanticism, that he wanted to say something personal. Something from the heart. He unfolded the paper. He began to speak about trust. About how he had never believed, before meeting me, that he could be truly known by another person. About how I had changed that. About how, standing in front of our family and friends, he wanted to say plainly that he intended to spend his life being worthy of what I had given him. I watched him deliver every word with the steadiness of a man who had practiced. I thought about the words beneficiary amendment. I thought about the phrase, she'll sign it before she figures out what it actually does. I thought about 2 years and every dinner and holiday and ordinary Tuesday those 2 years contained, and what had been happening underneath all of them. He finished his vows. He folded the paper. He looked at me with an expression that was either love or an extraordinarily detailed replica of it. It was my turn. I reached into the small fold of fabric at my bouquet's base where I had tucked my own piece of paper. I unfolded it. I looked at it for one moment. Then I looked up at the officiant and said, before I say my vows, I'd like to share something with everyone here. A recording. I told Caleb this morning I had a surprise planned for the reception. I'd like to share it now instead. The room tilted slightly, the way rooms do when something unexpected happens in a place built entirely around expectation. Caleb's expression didn't break immediately. It flickered. Just once. The way a signal flickers before it goes out. I reached up and touched the locket at my bouquet. Dominique's hand moved at the sound booth. And then Caleb's voice filled the room. Not from the altar. From everywhere. The first 3 seconds were the most important ones. That is what I remember most clearly now, looking back. Not the gasp that moved through the room like a wave finding a shore. Not the sound of a chair shifting in the second row, where Lauren was sitting. Not the way Caleb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before his face rearranged itself into something that was trying very hard to look confused. The first 3 seconds were the ones where 200 people heard his voice come out of the speakers and looked at the altar and realized the voice was coming from the man standing on it. There is no recovering from that moment. You can try. Caleb tried. But there is something that happens to a lie when it fills a room. It takes up the same space that trust used to occupy, and there isn't room for both. The recording ran for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I know the exact duration because I had listened to it 6 times in the 3 weeks since I bought the locket. The first time I listened, I sat in my car in a parking garage for 40 minutes afterward without moving. The subsequent times I listened with a notepad, writing down timestamps and phrases and the specific sequence of revelations, because I needed to understand not just what they had planned, but in what order they had planned it, and what that order revealed about how long the planning had been happening. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. In that time, the room heard Caleb explain the beneficiary amendment in his own words. They heard him describe my trust fund as the primary asset and my signature as the only remaining obstacle. They heard him say that pregnant women were easier to guide toward financial decisions when those decisions were framed as security for the baby. They heard Lauren ask what would happen if I consulted Richard Cho independently, and they heard Caleb say that he had already had a conversation with someone at Richard's firm to make sure the amendment language looked routine. That detail I had not known before I played the recording in the church. I felt it land in my chest like something cold and precise. Richard Cho heard it from the back of the room. I did not look at him. I didn't need to. I knew Richard well enough to know that what he was feeling in that moment was not surprise. It was the specific fury of a professional man who has just discovered that his integrity was used as a prop in someone else's scheme. The room heard Lauren say she wanted it done before the baby came, because a new mother was even more manageable than a pregnant woman, and she was not spending another year watching me live the life she deserved. The life she deserved. 200 people heard my sister say that about me in her own voice, in her own cadence, with the particular confidence of someone who has rehearsed a belief so many times it no longer feels like resentment. It feels like fact. I kept my eyes on the middle distance, not on Caleb, not on Lauren, not on my mother, because I could not afford to see my mother's face in that moment and remain standing. When the recording ended, the silence that followed was the kind that has texture. You could feel people deciding what to do with what they had just heard. Some of them would never have words for it. Some of them were already constructing the story they would tell later. But all of them, every single person in that room, understood that what had just happened was irreversible. Caleb moved first. He reached toward me, not aggressively, carefully, the way you reach towards something fragile you are trying to contain, and said my name in a low voice. Evelyn. He said it the way he always said it when he wanted me to lower my temperature. Like my name was a de-escalation tool. I took one step back. He pivoted to the room. His hands came up, open-palmed. The universal gesture of a man who wants to appear as though he has nothing to hide, performed by a man who has been hiding things for 2 years. He said the recording was private. He said it was taken out of context. He said that what sounded like a financial scheme was actually a conversation about protecting our family's future, and that anyone who had ever navigated complex estate planning would understand that the language could sound alarming without the full picture. He used the phrase full picture twice. A woman in the 6th row, who I later learned was a retired family court judge named Patricia Wells, folded her hands in her lap and looked at Caleb the way I imagined she had looked at a great many people who had stood before her attempting a version of this exact performance. Lauren stood up. I had not expected that. Lauren's instinct, historically, had always been to go still when she was in danger, to become quiet and small and sympathetic-looking until whatever storm was passing had moved on. Standing up in front of 200 people was not the Lauren I had spent 31 years knowing. She said the recording was manipulated. She said I had always been jealous of her relationship with Caleb. She said that my pregnancy had made me paranoid and that the family had been worried about my emotional stability for months. There it was. The word stability. I had been waiting for it the way you wait for a word you know is coming in a sentence someone is constructing in real time. It was always going to arrive. A woman with power who refuses to be controlled will always eventually be handed the word stability, like it is a diagnosis, rather than a deflection. I turned to face her directly. The room went quieter, which I had not thought was possible. Lauren, I said, the recording wasn't edited. But even if you believe it was, Caleb just confirmed that those were private conversations. Which means he recognized his own voice planning something he doesn't want 200 people to know about. And you just confirmed yours. She opened her mouth. She closed it. My uncle Marcus had moved to stand near the sound booth, not because anyone had asked him to in that moment, but because Marcus Hartwell had spent 40 years in rooms where power shifted and he knew how to occupy space when it mattered. Caleb changed direction again. He was good at that, at reading which approach was failing and pivoting before the failure became visible. He turned to me and dropped his voice and said that we should take this somewhere private, that we were upsetting our guests, that whatever I believed I had heard, there were explanations, and he deserved the chance to give them to me without an audience. Private, I said. You keep using that word. I reached into the small pocket inside my bouquet and removed a single folded document. I held it where the room could see it without being able to read it. This is the beneficiary amendment your attorney submitted to Richard Cho's firm 11 days ago, I said. I found out about it not because I was suspicious of you, but because Richard flagged the language to me independently after the contact you made at his firm made him uncomfortable enough to check with me directly. The color left Caleb's face the way water leaves a glass that has been tipped over. Completely and quickly, and with no possibility of return. Richard Cho's voice came from the back of the room. Calm and precise, and carrying the particular authority of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment. He said, "For the record, I did receive an inquiry from an associate of Mr. Merritt's 3 weeks ago regarding the routine nature of the amendment. I found the inquiry unusual enough to bring to Evelyn's attention immediately. At her direction, I have spent the past 3 weeks documenting the full scope of what was being attempted. That documentation has already been submitted to 2 separate family law attorneys and a financial crimes investigator this morning. This morning, while I was getting my hair pinned and my veil adjusted and my makeup set with a sponge that smelled like powder and roses, Richard Cho had been filing paperwork that would make the next chapter of Caleb Merritt's life considerably more complicated than he had planned." Caleb looked at Richard. He looked at me. He looked at the document in my hand. Then he looked at Lauren. And something in that look, the specific calculation of it, the way he was already assessing what she might say and how much damage she could do, told Lauren everything she needed to know about what she had actually been to him. I watched my sister's face change. Not into grief. Not yet. Into something harder and more clarifying. The expression of a woman who has just realized that the person she betrayed her family for had been using her the same way he was using everyone else. She sat back down. Slowly. Without a word. I placed the document on the small table beside the officiant's podium, next to the unity candle that had never been lit, and I turned back to the 200 people who had come to Charleston to watch me get married. "I want to thank every single one of you for being here," I said. "You came for a wedding. What you witnessed instead was the reason I am not having one." I touched my stomach, just once, just briefly. And then I said the thing I had decided 3 weeks ago I would say if it ever came to this. The thing I had written on a notepad in a parking garage while I was still too stunned to drive home. I said, "My child will know that their mother stood in a room full of people and chose truth over a beautiful lie. That is the only vow I needed to make today." The room was completely silent. And then, from somewhere in the middle of the left section, someone began to clap. Not enthusiastically. Slowly. The kind of applause that is less celebration and more witness, the sound of people acknowledging something real. I did not smile. I did not look at Caleb again. I picked up my bouquet, held the locket against my palm, and walked back down the aisle. Behind me, I heard Caleb say my name one more time. Marcus stepped into the aisle before he could follow. And I kept walking, straight through the doors and into the Charleston afternoon, where the air smelled like salt water and cut grass and the particular freshness that comes after something has finally, irrevocably ended. I had not cried yet. That would come later. But first, there was one more conversation I had not planned for, one that would happen in the parking lot 20 minutes later and would change the shape of everything that followed in ways I had not anticipated. Lauren found me by the magnolia tree at the edge of the estate parking lot. I had not expected her to be the one who came. I had expected Caleb, or Priya in damage control mode, or possibly my mother, who I had watched from the corner of my eye as I walked down the aisle and who had not moved from her seat, had simply sat with her handkerchief pressed flat against her mouth like she was holding something and that needed to stay held. But it was Lauren, still in her dusty rose bridesmaid dress, her heels in her hand because the gravel was uneven, her eye makeup tracking slightly down one cheekbone. She walked toward me without the performance I had braced for. No opening argument. No defensive posture. She stopped about 4 feet away and looked at me the way people look at something they have broken and are only now understanding the full dimensions of. She said, "I don't have an excuse." I looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was doing something generous to the trees around us, the kind of golden late-day light that makes everything look more forgiving than it is. I said, "I know." She pressed her lips together. She looked down at the heels in her hand. When she looked back up, something in her face was different from anything I had seen from her in the church, different from the performance of sisterly concern, different from the defiance she had attempted when she stood up in front of the guests, different from the hollowness that had settled over her when Caleb's look told her the truth about her own position in his plan. She looked tired. Not the tired that comes from a long day. The tired that comes from carrying something heavy for so long that you have stopped noticing the weight until the moment you are forced to put it down. She said, "He came to me first. 2.5 years ago. He told me he had feelings for me that he was trying to suppress because of you. He made it sound like a tragedy he was managing nobly. And I let that be enough. I let that be the story because I wanted it to be." I said, "Lauren."
She said, "I know."
"I know that's not." I said, "I'm not asking you to explain it. I'm telling you I already understand it. That's the part that's going to take me the longest to get over. Not that it happened. That I can see exactly how it happened, and I can see exactly which parts of both of you I missed, and I can trace every moment where I looked directly at the truth and chose a different interpretation because the truth was one I didn't want." She was quiet for a moment. A car moved slowly through the far end of the parking lot. Someone's grandmother being helped toward a sedan by a young man in a too large suit jacket. Lauren said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to have my baby. I'm going to unwind every legal document Caleb touched. I'm going to rebuild whatever needs rebuilding and protect whatever doesn't. And then I'm going to figure out what kind of life I actually want, which is something I apparently stopped doing at some point in the last 3 years because I was too busy maintaining the version of my life that looked correct from the outside." She nodded slowly. I said, "What are you going to do?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked out at the tree line beyond the parking lot, at the place where the estate grounds ended and the ordinary world began. She said, "I gave him things, Evelyn. Documents. Information about the trust structure. Things I had access to because I was your sister and you trusted me with them. I need to tell Richard that." I looked at her. She said, "I know it doesn't fix it. I know that's the floor, not the ceiling. But it's what I can do right now, and I'm going to do it." I thought about the 31 years of her. The specific weight of a sister. The way that relationship contains more history than almost any other, more accumulated texture, more of the particular sediment that builds up between two people who grew up in the same house and learned the world from the same set of original sources. I thought about what it means to grieve someone who is still standing in front of you. I said, "Go find Richard. Tell him everything. Every conversation, every document, every date you can remember. Don't protect Caleb in any of it." She said, "I won't." I said, "And Lauren, don't do it for me. Do it because it's the only version of yourself you're going to be able to live with." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, put her heels back on with the careful concentration of someone performing a small, ordinary task in the middle of an extraordinary day, and walked back toward the estate. I watched her go. I did not feel warmth toward her yet. That would be a longer road if it existed at all. But I felt something I had not expected to feel, which was a kind of clarity about her, as though the version of Lauren I had been carrying in my imagination, the one built from childhood and loyalty and the softened edges that love applies to the people we want to see a certain way, had finally been replaced by the actual person. Smaller in some ways. More legible. Possibly, in the long run, more honest than the version I had spent 3 decades believing in. My mother appeared at the estate doors. She crossed the parking lot without hurrying, which was how I knew she had decided something before she left the building. My mother only moved without hurrying when she already knew what she was going to say. She stopped beside me at the magnolia tree. She did not touch me immediately. She looked at my face for a long moment, the way mothers look at their children when they are trying to read something that isn't on the surface. Then she put her hand over mine where it rested on my stomach. She said, "Your father would have stood up in that room." I said, "I know." She said, "I didn't. I sat there, and I watched you handle it alone, and I am going to have to carry that for a while."
I said, "Mom."
She said, "Let me say it. I need to say it once so I can put it somewhere." I sat in the front row of my daughter's wedding and watched her dismantle a fraud that had been built around her while I had no idea it was happening, and the thing that is breaking my heart right now is not just that they did it. It's that you didn't feel like you could tell me you suspected something. And I think I know why. And I think fixing that is my work to do, not yours. I leaned into her then.
Not elegantly.
The way you lean into your mother when you have been holding yourself upright through something that required everything you had, and you have reached the moment when the requirement has ended.
She put her arm around me. She said, "You were extraordinary in there."
I said, "I was terrified." She said, "Those aren't opposites, sweetheart." We stood there for a while under the magnolia tree while the wedding gradually dissolved behind us. Guests filtering out, cars beginning to move, the sound of the string quartet stopping mid-piece, as someone finally told them there was nothing left to play for. The white magnolias in the evening light looked exactly as beautiful as they had that morning. Beauty doesn't revise itself when the context changes. That used to bother me. It didn't anymore. Richard Cho called me that evening. He told me that Lauren had come to him and had spent 2 hours providing a detailed account of every piece of information she had shared with Caleb, every conversation she remembered, every document she had accessed on his behalf. He said her cooperation was thorough and that it was going to matter significantly in the legal proceedings to come. He also told me that Caleb's contact at his firm, a junior associate named Trevor, 27 years old, and apparently under the impression that Caleb was simply trying to expedite standard paperwork, had come forward independently when he understood what the documents had actually been for. Trevor had kept copies of his communications with Caleb's team. Richard described those copies as extraordinarily useful, in the understated way that attorneys describe things that are in fact devastating. I said, "How long will this take?" Richard said, "The annulment will be straightforward given the documented fraud. The financial exposure on his side is more complex, but Evelyn, he handed us the architecture of his own scheme in his own voice. We have it in a recording, in text messages, in documents, and now in testimony from 2 cooperating parties. What he built to take from you is going to be what dismantles him." I said, "I don't want to destroy him, Richard." He said, "I understand. But you do want to protect your child, and the law will not always let you separate those 2 things cleanly. We protect the child. Whatever happens to him as a result of that is the result of what he chose to do." That sat right with me. I held on to it. My son was born 7 weeks later on a Tuesday morning in October, when the Carolina sky was that specific shade of pale blue that doesn't have a name, but that you recognize instantly as the color of the beginning of something. He was 8 pounds 4 ounces. He was loud and opinionated from the first moment, which I chose to take as a sign of excellent character. I named him James after my father. My mother was in the room. Dominique was in the room, wearing a hospital bracelet she had somehow acquired as though she were a patient, which I did not question. Richard sent flowers. Marcus sent a card that said simply, "The Hartwell name is in good hands," which made me cry in the specific way that you cry when someone says the right thing at the right moment without knowing quite how right it is. The locket was on the table beside my hospital bed, not as a reminder of what it had recorded, but because it was my grandmother's and it was beautiful, and it belonged to the story of where I came from in ways that had nothing to do with any of this. The annulment was finalized 4 months later. The beneficiary amendment was voided in its entirety. 2 civil claims related to financial fraud and breach of fiduciary duty were settled in the subsequent year without going to trial, which Richard said was the outcome of a defendant who understood that a courtroom was a worse option than a settlement when the evidence against him had been stored inside a piece of jewelry and played through a church sound system in front of 200 witnesses. Caleb never contacted me directly again. He sent one message through his attorney in the early weeks that used the phrase mutual healing, which I found so extraordinary that I kept it as a document in a folder I labeled miscellaneous fictions. Lauren and I did not speak for 8 months. She sent a letter in the spring. Not an apology exactly, more an accounting, a list of the things she had done and understood herself to have done, and was not asking forgiveness for so much as acknowledgement of. I read it 3 times. Then I called her. We are not what we were. I do not know if we will ever be what we were. But we are something, which is more than I thought was possible standing in that parking lot in a wedding dress with magnolias in my hair, and everything I believed about her still warm and ruined in my hands. Some things that break do not mend. Some things that break mend into something different from what they were, and different does not have to mean lesser. My father left me a letter that Richard had been holding in trust until I had my first child. I did not know the letter existed until James was 3 weeks old and Richard handed me an envelope with my name on it in my father's handwriting, and I had to sit down before I could open it. My father wrote, The people who try to take from you will always underestimate how much your grandfather and I built into you. Not into your accounts. Into you. When the time comes that someone tries to reach what is yours by going through who you are, and that time will come, remember that the foundation is not in any document I ever signed. It is in every decision you make when you believe no one important is watching. I read that letter in the morning light in James's nursery while he slept in the crib beside me. I thought about a hallway in Charleston. I thought about cold marble through a wedding dress and a locket pressed against my palm, and the moment I chose to keep listening instead of walking away. I thought about the particular quality of that decision, the way it had not felt like courage in the moment, only like the most accurate available response to a situation that required precision above everything else. I thought about what my father had called a foundation. James made a small sound in his sleep. His hands opened and closed the way newborns' hands do, reaching for something in whatever dream a 10-week-old is capable of having. I put my hand on his back.
He settled.
Outside, the October morning was doing what October mornings in Carolina do, burning off the early mist slowly, light moving through it at an angle that turns the ordinary into something worth looking at. I had not lost a wedding that day in Charleston. I had lost a performance of a life that someone else had written for me, cast me in, and intended to direct from a room I was never supposed to know about. What I had instead was this room, this morning, this child, this name that belonged to my father and now belonged to my son and would belong, in whatever form he chose for it, to everything he became, and a locket on the nightstand that had done what all the best inherited things do, carried the past safely into a moment that needed it, then quietly stepped aside. If someone has ever mistaken your silence for surrender, understand this. Silence is not the absence of power. Sometimes it is the room where power goes to load. I chose truth over a beautiful lie. And my son will know, has always known, even before he had the words for it, that the first sound he heard in this world, before my voice, before his grandmother's prayers, before anything else, was a recording of the moment his mother decided he would never have to inherit someone else's deception. That was the only inheritance that mattered. That was the only vow I needed to keep.